ultimately, let's be real about it, most people are buying Bitcoin in order to get more dollars. And while that might make sense for some people at certain times, I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, you buy Bitcoin to have less dollars. And so this is really to emphasize that point and kind of just get our brains turning about what could the next 250 or 300 years or so look like theoretically if Bitcoin is what we think it is. And this is not price predictions, so don't worry about that. I'll get into that later. But basically, the larger question that I find fascinating, I was just speaking with some people before that ultimately led me to Bitcoin in large part, is thinking about where in history are we? We have this story where there's like the ancient world, and we're in today, and then what's the future going to look like, and how do I understand where I am in that story? Our whole lives we tell ourselves stories, and I think understanding where we are technologically is a really important part of that. So, human population. We're all humans. This is human population from long time ago to less long time ago to today. Now, most people look at this and they're like, oh my goodness, population's exploding, overpopulation. This is something that started about 200 years ago with the Industrial Revolution. And that, to a certain extent, is true. I mean, you look at this and it's quite stark. You have no people, and then a little people, and then all the people. But one of the things I really want to emphasize with this, I think, this doesn't cater well to our brains that think in linear terms, is thinking about this in different periods of history. This whole idea of overpopulation, this whole idea of having too much pollution, or not enough land, or not enough food, or not enough energy, or not enough. This is nothing new. Rome was dealing with the same thing. The European colonies are dealing with the same thing. This idea and this problem or this fear of overpopulation being just down the road, it keeps getting pushed back and back and back. And I'll get more into why it keeps being pushed back and back, but we can look clearly at any specific period of history, it's the exact same thing. If you look about 6,000 years ago, it's the same case. Population is growing exponentially, going from 5 million to 15 million, tripling in that given period of time. We're going from 30 million in 3000 BCE to up to, 40 million or so to 100 million. It's the same story then, thousands of years later, hundreds of years later. Same thing a couple hundred years ago, same thing even farther back, same thing in the transition from BCE to AD, and ultimately, again, the full chart in the end there. So what I think the full chart of human population does a disservice of is it does a disservice in failing to understand that chart has been exponential the whole time. And this is one of the things, again, to go back to one of my favorites Jeff Booth talks about, is about how if you double the height of a folded piece of paper, inherently, the last 1, 2, and 3 iterations are the vast majority of the growth of the entire time. And that's the same case here. And anyway, I'll get into my larger point here. And so my question is, what happens into the future? Right now we've got 8 billion people, just over 8 billion people, and the UN projects that that's going to probably peak towards the later end of the century and perhaps flatline or decline. Personally, as my personal speculation, I think as many people may know, the currently falling birth rate, I think is in large part due to the fiat regime. As people are having their time squeezed tighter and tighter and tighter, that economically incentivizes split-parent households. That means less children. That means higher costs for childcare and everything like that. And so if we think into the future, not a couple of decades here, no the dates, but thinking the long-term future, what could we expect for the human population? And obviously this is just a 23-year-old putting a little slide together, but I think it emphasizes a point. The point being that human population into the future should either grow or decrease. And which is more likely? Decrease is possible. Maybe we'll have some disaster. Maybe artificial intelligence turns on us. Or, you could list out 100 dangers of the future, and I actually think the largest dangers are in the future, not yet today. I don't think nuclear war is the largest danger that we'll face. But either we can be optimists or pessimists. Either population will continue to grow or it will decrease. And one of the thought experiments I love to think about with that is, what about our land use? What if we become 10 times more efficient, 30 times more efficient, 50 times more efficient at growing food per acre of land? The vast majority of land that humanity uses is for livestock and agriculture. And we're biased again because we live in cities and urban areas to think that the whole world's an urban area. But reality is there's a lot of land out there. There's a lot of energy out there with the discovery of new forms of energy. it seems to me more probable than not that the population will continue to grow. Maybe 10 billion, 20, 12 billion, who knows? But it seems at some point in the future, it should be higher today, because that's exactly what's happened in every other society in the past. It doesn't matter where you are in the world or when you are in the world. Everyone thought there couldn't be more people, we can't have more energy. And the reality is that we find ways to innovate and have new technologies that can sustain that higher population. One of the, Fritz Haber, I believe, with the Haber process for nitrogen, for example, his innovation alone of figuring out how to inject nitrogen into the soil and helping us have better food production, that alone is responsible for roughly 4 billion of today's population. 150 years ago, there was not enough land to feed everybody because we were exhausting nitrogen too fast in the soil. And then with that one innovation, boom, you can now double the human population, or at least double the food capacity. So anyway, that's just a visual idea of the chart here. And so even if we're pessimists and we assume technology, the speed of technological progress slows, we assume that this flatlining birth rates predicted continues for 1,000 years or so, which has never happened before in human history globally. Even if we assume that's the case, then even in that case, there'll be more humans born in the next couple hundred years than the sum total of human history before now. And so this obviously gets into my thought process of thinking about other forms of technology. Take the printing press, for example. If we were roughly 400, 450 years ago at the very beginnings of the printing press, first 10, 20 years or so, and I were to come to you and shake my family and say, this printing press thing's a big deal, it's going to change the world, we're going to be all reading and you don't even understand, this is going to be a really big deal. And most people are yet to be born over the next couple hundred years, and those people will only know and accept and take for granted this printing press and reading and all that or whatever. And it would sound crazy to them, because from their perspective, in 1470 or 1480 or 1460 or wherever this theoretical example is, from their perspective, the sum total of history before them, the vast majority have never been able to read, and it just seems ludicrous. There's not enough resources, there's not enough time, there's not enough humans to create all those more humans, and even if they did, of course the majority of them will still not be able to read. We can't even have the majority of people read now. Books are too expensive or a scam, whatever. So that's the basic idea, that I have no idea what the future has, none of us do, but if you just do the math and you do the arithmetic and map it out, even if population stays flat from end of century onwards, there are more people ahead of us than behind us, which to me is very optimistic. The majority of great artists, theoretically, are ahead of us. The majority of brilliant thinkers are ahead of us. The majority of wonderful scientists and engineers that could perhaps find those technologies and inventions are ahead of us. So anyway, I find that to be very exciting. And so likewise, I'm saying with these technological sources, I touched on this in the earlier presentation, so I won't dive into that, but it's the same idea. In the same way that human population is a continuing exponential trend, it's not something new in the last couple of hundred years. The speed is increasing, the speed of change is increasing, but it's been an exponential trend. The same thing with technology. If you go back hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, like I was saying earlier, the vast majority of humans' energy consumption and production was biomass. Chop down trees, burn wood. Very inefficient, a lot of wasted heat, very bad on the planet. And so you have this little new innovation of coal that begins, and it just explodes, and it becomes a new form of dominant energy. And likewise, the big example and the larger example there, it's the same idea. And so my wonder, my thought speculation is, what if all those new forms of energy, solar, modern biofuels, wind, hydropower, nuclear, perhaps fission, in the coming years or decades or whatever, what if each of those is like another one of coal here? It's just a thought experiment, but to me, even though none of us know the future, it seems more probable than not that we'll keep innovating, because if there are only more people, and there's only a greater need to service those people, the economic incentive seems pretty inevitable to me. It seems the only alternate is something really depressing, so I just said that. So likewise, on the previous, again, building up the first half of the presentation here, same idea. So 1350, 700 years ago, it's not even that long ago in human history. It's incredible. But all the way out to today, and then from the early 1800s up to today, again, this has been an exponential growing, doubling, as Jeff Booth says, going from fold 0 to fold 50. The first folds seem inconsequential. We forget that they were folds in the first place. And so if we overlay these technologies, like I was referring to earlier, you have a newspaper, printing press around here in this area, you have the New World discovered, the canon, all these technologies that were massive leaps for each of these societies that would have been unrecognizable. In the same way that I joke about how do you explain to somebody from here the iPhone? Well, how do you explain to somebody in the year 500 the canon? I mean, to them, that's just as indescribable as the iPhone is to somebody from here. Or, the same thing with each of these innovations. How do you explain to somebody, or discoveries, innovations or discoveries, it's the same idea. And the speed at which these worldviews are changing is also speeding up. And so again, speculating into the future, perhaps energy flatlines, or perhaps it increases, and perhaps it goes way out of that and down below. But to me, that seems to be inherently an extremely pessimistic view, and there's a possibility that happens. But if energy production can't keep up with that, well, to me, that inherently seems to be there's a bifurcation between the total energy needs of humanity, because our population is growing up, it's currently growing up, and if our energy flatlines, I think that inherently means that there's some sort of massive shortage, or massive famine, or anything like that. And so I think because we can assume that economic incentive will be there, I think we can assume we'll find a way to do it, because this whole time we've been able to do that. And I know it looks absurd, but if we look at any other point in history, that's my point, that it looks a little less absurd in that context. And so obviously you can see, computer here, which already is like forever ago in technological terms, and then the internet, and then Bitcoin there, and then after a little blip there today, which we'll get more to in just a moment. And so this idea is what I mean by like our technological window, that if we're in the year 2023 or so, we can envision what life looked like to a certain degree back, and we can envision it into the future. Right now we have autonomous robots or whatever, all these humanoid robots, you have the Elon Musk robot, you have Boston Dynamics robot and all that. We have all these things, and we can kind of envision what they'll do in the future, we can kind of envision them, but at a certain point, it's like, we don't even know what they'll really do. We can't even picture the applications for them. The locomotive I gave an example of before, most of the use cases for the locomotive, you wouldn't have been able to predict or describe in the early 1800s or so. That most of those use cases were yet to be discovered. And that's kind of the idea here, that looking back, we can read history, but it's hard for us to intuitively understand. And looking forward, I believe it's the same way, that at a certain point it gets so fuzzy that all this is just, who knows? And at a certain point, prediction becomes more or less worthless. And so like I'm saying, if these things are continuing to speed up, well, then it seems to me that over the coming centuries, as the majority of people are ahead of us, the majority of art, the majority of innovation, the majority of science, the majority of discoveries are ahead of us, the majority of change, theoretically, should also be ahead of us. So if one of these windows was 1,000 years, maybe it was 800 years, maybe 500, maybe now it's 50 or 80 or whatever it is, and perhaps it's different for each person. But as I was just speaking to someone who unfortunately left before the second part of the show about, he had a young daughter, and we were having that conversation of how in her life she'll have only faster and faster iterations. And anyway, I find that fascinating in thinking about. And so if we think about that overlaying with monetary eras, we have this era where gold was the monetary, the dominant form of monetary, the dominant monetary system in the world. And then as the world required an energy upgrade, as it required faster velocity, and gold couldn't fulfill that, we had the adoption of credit and central banking and all these other things from the Dutch onward, more or less. The Dutch are basically the beginning of what we call modern central banking. And so we have this window where we can look back and we can imagine what the world looked like. Gas prices were much cheaper 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but we can understand how they work because they use cash just like we do. It makes sense to us. And so my question, my postulation is, we're 14 years into Bitcoin or so. We're not yet where Bitcoin's the monetary standard of the world, but what could that look like? If the majority of that is outside our window, is it even reasonable to try to predict what that could look like? And so my question being that if we go from an inferior and a former technological system into a new and a superior and a better technological system, how do you even price them between each other? It's like saying, how do you price a light bulb in terms of candle? How do you price an iPhone in terms of movable type? How do you price X and Y? It's like at a certain point, it becomes absurd because you're dealing with the world and artifacts, And so when it comes to predicting prices for Bitcoin, or we can joke about when's going to hit 100K or laserize to 100K or a million or 10 million or 100 million or whatever, but ultimately the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that if we just take these basic truths about, or these basic presuppositions and assumptions about technology being incongruent with other forms and other eras, seems to me that Bitcoin should cost theoretically every conceivable fiat price possible. You don't even need the hyperbolic chart that was laid out before. It's just that kind of mental framework that I have to emphasize. And so the cool thing to me that I get really terrified and excited about simultaneously is thinking about, wow, we're in like this window where the thing has been invented and it's not yet the dominant form. It's like being alive at the beginning of the printing press and realizing, wow, this thing is going to make everyone literate. And I'm here in time where the technology exists, the thing exists, and yet the majority of people still aren't literate. And so it's like you're in between, you have a foot in each world. Greg and I were joking earlier about how being a Bitcoiner and understanding is kind of like being a time traveler from the future, but yet you don't really remember the future, obviously, because it hasn't happened yet. But it's kind of like the same feeling, that you feel like you're in like a different world almost. You're like moving around everyone else. It's like you see the world differently. And this is, I think, fundamentally what it comes down to. The people around us aren't any different. It's just we have a different technological worldview what the future could look like. Well, another example I think about when again, relating it back to Boston Dynamics, is thinking about those humanoid robots. If there's 1,000 of those today, and the total number of those increases, say 50%, 30%, or something like that, every year from here on out. I mean, what was the math? I think it was by the late 2040s. There's humans still outnumber the robots like 300 to 1 or 350 to 1 or something. But even in that case, then the robots theoretically eventually would outnumber humans at some point. And so what if we're in this weird spot where artificial intelligence is here? We all heard ChatGPT and all that. What if we're in this point where it exists and yet the majority of intelligence is still human, or perhaps already past that point or whatever? Or what if we're in period where humanoid robots exist, but they don't yet outnumber humans, or like real humans, artificial humans versus real humans. And so anyway, in the same line of those visualizing those future technologies and describing as past technologies, I think it's a similar way with Bitcoin, that we are in this current window where we can envision the past before Bitcoin, and we can envision the past, or we can envision the future a little ways. But we're in this weird spot where Bitcoin exists and it has value, but yet it's not taking over everything. There are thousands of years behind us that Bitcoin had no value. And theoretically, there are decades, perhaps centuries, and perhaps a millennia, or maybe even longer, that Bitcoin has value. And so it's like, wow, there's all these years ahead of us where the world's completely different from today, and all those years behind us where the world's completely different from today. And we're in this narrow slice where we have an arm in both. And so anyway, and then this is the hyperbolic curve that we talked about earlier, kind of like trying to visualize it, going from 0 to 1, going from less than a cent for 2 years all the way up to 100 to 100,000 or $1 billion or whatever, and then up higher. So anyway, it's just that kind of visual conceptualization that I find fascinating. And if we try to zoom that in and put it into a larger point, and again, logarithmic terms, because technology is exponential, what if, not saying this is a certainty, but what if it's something more or less like this? That Bitcoin's nothing for a couple of years, and then it trades up and down with a volatile fashion, becoming more and more volatile as we end our little window here where we're transitioning from the old to the new. And then at a certain point, it just becomes absurd. Like, how do you predict the value of Bitcoin? How do you price, like the flight I took today, how do you price that to somebody in 1850? You don't even know how to communicate these things. And ultimately, that's why I think, saying Bitcoin go to this price or that price is interesting, and all that, for people that are already into Bitcoin or people that are already new to Bitcoin. But I think ultimately, the thing that is perhaps more difficult to explain, but likely the more rewarding and the more fulfilling and the more helpful in people understanding what's really going on here, is explaining the two paradigms and how at a certain point we can assume, even without Bitcoin, technology should advance to a degree at which trying to equate today's value in terms of that doesn't even make sense. So at that certain point, then theoretically, it becomes almost impossible to price Bitcoin. So, perhaps that means it flatlines for a few years. Perhaps it means it rises up and down these 4-year cycles like it has been the last 14 years or so. We just continue that for a while. But it seems to me, one way or another, human population has to increase, our energy production has to increase if we're going to assume the future is bright, and the ultimate value of Bitcoin in that future would theoretically just continue forever at a volatile rate, and an increasingly volatile rate. And that's one of the things people have trouble understanding about why is it valuable. Well, you need it to be volatile in order to keep up with the productivity gains from those innovations and those technologies flowing back to society via the money. You have to have it be volatile. If it keeps its value, how does it make this cross? How does it make the chasm? Volatility is a feature in that aspect to an even larger degree than what I think we understand today. And so again, putting the windows that we have earlier overlaid onto this, perhaps we have this window, and then, in the later part of the century, but then we have another one, and, on and on and on, to where it becomes just absurd to even talk about. More or less, we would theoretically be here. This one being logarithmic, that one being linear. Basically, Bitcoin might go to 100,000, maybe a million, maybe 10 million a decade or two out or so, or whatever. But if we assume that the monopoly dollars will convert into real dollars, the real dollar should hit every exchangeable rate with the monopoly dollars, and they should cross that chasm into forms of innovation that we can't even articulate, which goes back to the beautiful thing that theoretically it's never too late for people to buy Bitcoin. It might be too late for them to convert former technology into new technology. It might be too late for them to convert bonds or cash or gold into Bitcoin because the exchange rate no longer exists. That might be too late. But theoretically, if you have an immutable form of money that can survive no matter the paradigm shifts in technology, well, the beauty is that whether we're talking about people today or people 5 years from now or children or grandchildren, theoretically, no matter how valuable Bitcoin becomes, it should theoretically never be too late, because we can assume that the future has hope and the future is optimistic. And saving for the future is inherently optimistic. So you think that the productivity gains of the world are going to go down, well then, your problem is not saving a Bitcoin, your problem is saving it all. Why would you save if you think the future is inherently going to be pessimistic? So anyway, overlaying those three ideas together, population, energy, Bitcoin, it's kind of like the same idea. Who knows what's going to happen? But I think all three will trend together in whichever direction that is. Either they'll all go up together, or they'll all go down together. And so that's kind of my thought process and speculation there. And this is a fun little point about how, if we assume our tech window is out to the mid to late 21st century, well, the block reward will be 596 sats over here in the early 22nd century, and then 0 sats obviously in 2140, as almost surely all of us know. And so it's like, what if by the time the total block reward globally is 500, is basically 600 sats, what if that technology is already so advanced we can't understand it? It's like, how do you even price what these tiny amounts are? I mean, how do you do that? I don't know. And so, anyway, that's the basic point of this, is to emphasize to folks that probably, in my opinion, what will happen is that most people will buy here or here, somewhere in here, maybe at 30,000 like it is today, or 300,000 like it will probably be in a couple of years, or 3 million, or even 30 million. People might buy these prices and then sell later to go back into cash. And it's like, there's never a right time to sell your ticket to a lifeboat to get back on the ship. There's never a right time to sell modern technology for ancient technology. And I think that will only become more clear to people in time, but I hope that thinking this way really helps people lower the time preference and educate others, not from the perspective, you gotta buy Bitcoin because it's gonna go up, but you gotta buy Bitcoin because it's a superior form of technology. And if it survives, then inevitably, the exchange rate to the former technology has to trend to zero forever until it's merely an artifact of the ancient world. So anyway, I hope this has been of interest and helpful to you. So anyway, thank you. Appreciate it. Well, just a little plug too. I'm on the Orange Pill app. They're one of our wonderful sponsors tonight, so that's the real me. and that's Romy on Twitter if you want to follow me on there. I keep hearing there's a lot of fake news, so don't follow the fake news. You might be real life here, so please follow the real, you don't get scammed. So anyway, that's it. And then, oh yeah, and upcoming projects. I've gotten a lot of questions saying, what do you do next, what do you do next? So if I could just say that real quick. I just started a YouTube channel. I'm doing a bunch of podcasts. I have podcasts with Jeff Booth and Greg Foss and a whole bunch of other financial advisors, investors. Many are pro-Bitcoin, some are anti-Bitcoin. So if you want to check that out, I'm posting everything, and I'm having a blast doing it, just hearing other people's perspectives. So YouTube is just my name, Luke Broyles. Twitter, I'm on Twitter, obviously, like I just said. Miami and Toronto, I'm going to the Miami conference in May, and then I'm going to the Toronto one in, what is that, June? The Canadian Bitcoin? June 17th, there you go. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, I should be going to that too. They invited me there. I'm really appreciative of that, and I work on some other projects that will come down the pipe later. So anyway, thanks. Yeah, if you're interested, I'm in town in Boston here for a few more days this weekend and early next week. If you want to meet up, grab coffee, lunch, or whatever, feel free to message me on either Twitter or comment at me on Twitter or message me on the Orange Pill. I'd love to meet you. I'm just hanging around, working, exploring, and seeing the city. So I'd love to meet I'd love not just see the buildings and the things here. I'd love to meet some of the people here too. So anyway, if you want to meet, just message me. I'm more than happy to meet you. So anyway, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And Jeff and Greg. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yeah, questions. Give me
Yeah, if anyone needs the mic, please.
Sure. Hello, Luke.
Hello.
I had an interesting thought last night, and I wanted to see if it goes along with your theories or changes your theories. Eventually, at some point, we are going to reach the point where the transistor gates on all of these chips that help us use this technology and eventually, mining as well, eventually that will reach its smallest size possible. Do you think that that's going to have an impact on the acceleration of these curves? Do you think that's going to cause people to more or less ape into mining, for lack of a better term? What do you think about that as an impact on technology and the growth of these trends?
Yeah, I think the only respectable answer to that is I don't know. I mean, it's one of those, going back to the examples of other technologies, it's like, I love reading history, and so many times we thought, oh, this is impossible, or this is the end, or whatever. And then we either find, oh, that wasn't the end, and it continues, or via some other different mechanism, or we pivot, or something like that. So I don't know. I do think that's an interesting question. But I think the economic incentive is there to find a solution, or pivot to some new thing. So, I mean, perhaps that's a challenge to Bitcoin. Perhaps it is. But in my view, even if Bitcoin has a 90% chance of failing to some event like that, I mean, the best case scenario for the dollar is it declines 99% over the next century. Forget hyperinflation, forget BRICS, forget all this other stuff. Like, our best case scenario is the dollar loses 98, 99%. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know, but I know even if that's an existential threat to Bitcoin, I'd rather have that than bonds or cash. So, anyway, it's just a rambling.
Thank you.
We all kind of probably either read Saif Dean's book or got involved with some kind of reading. My question is, where did you exponentially gain some knowledge? Because you started somewhere, and then you read a little bit more, and then you maybe had just huge growth, because clearly you're an intellectual, and you're probably a lot smarter than me and other people. But where was that?
Yeah.
Where can I find that knowledge besides talking to people?
I'd say the thing that did it for me was really understanding immutability and the fact that no human could change it. With my personal beliefs, I believe that all humans are, fall short of perfection, let's say. And so one of the things that really helped me go into hyperdrive about learning about that was realizing that even if I was in control of the money supply, or even if I was in control of setting up a board of other people that would control money, and realizing that no matter who's in office, no matter who's the supreme dictator, no matter what collective or on a global board, or like, nobody can do it right. Not even me. And that's not to say I'm better than anyone else. That's just to say we all have a bias towards ourselves. And I think that's a big part of the ego death that people talk about when it comes to Bitcoin. Is that, and I think it's ultimately the reason people ignore it, is because buying Bitcoin and understanding Bitcoin is inherently admitting that no human can do this job. Like, it's not even good or bad. It's like no human can do it. Inflation is inherently bad. And I think realizing that, for me, really emphasized, okay, this is something completely different than everything else, which I think then helps one understand, oh, this isn't like a security, this isn't like this other thing. So, and that's not so much like an answer that makes everything make sense, but to me, that's the realization that I've seen in myself and I've heard from other people that really encourage them to keep learning obsessively, because once you understand that, then I think it becomes clear how it's different from everything else. And so the only question is what happens from there, what the implications of that. So.
Great answer. Sorry, there we go.
All right, Luke, this is a challenge. It's kind of a challenge to everybody, but yeah, you're really brilliant. So one of the reasons I'm here is because I got panicked when I saw Elizabeth Warren's little thing. So I was like, I gotta go over and support the mass Bitcoiners. So one thing about that, and your theories kind of crack my brain all the time. But what are you doing? Maybe this is the next project. What are you doing to be able to transition that into either not necessarily education, but actually getting correlations between that to be able to combat this misinformation that's going on in politics and the New York Times and all these other things? And maybe you have an answer for that. I mean, everybody has a specific skill set, and so we should all be doing this based on what we feel like we're good at. You have a skill set of taking these super deep subjects and being able to project them out and putting things into a perspective for the normal person to see, oh yeah, we're just in this is the blip where we're at. But there's got to be a way that you can translate that for politicians. What you doing?
Honestly, I think just this. I mean, if, again, the printing press, it's perhaps not the best metaphor, but money's information, language is information, I think it's applicable. I mean, what's the point of worrying about who's Pope when ultimately the printing press is what takes away the majority of the misinformation from the Catholic Church? So, I mean, it's like, Donald Trump hates Bitcoin, Hillary Clinton hates Bitcoin, Bernie Sanders hates Bitcoin. It's like there are plenty of people on all the political aisles. And yeah, sure, I think everyone here has a political opinion, I'm sure, including me. But the thing is that ultimately politicians are, as Jason Lowry would say, like an abstract hierarchy atop brute force physical costs. And I mean, to me, it just seems that, yeah, at the end of the day, it's just a matter of education. And I don't know, this is the best I know to do. I don't think I can fix centralization from becoming a part of the centralized, it's like, I don't think I can fix that. I don't think any president can fix that. I don't think the Fed can fix that. I don't think you can find a solution to centralization from within centralization. And so,
What did you say?
Yeah.
What you're doing is I don't want to.
Yeah, no.
What you're doing is.
I understood that, thank you. Yeah, but I mean, I genuinely think that's the best thing one can do. I don't think becoming a politician and then pass a bunch of laws that make Bitcoin, I don't think that might help, but that doesn't solve it. So that's just my thought.
Luke, first I want to say thanks for coming to Mass. I really appreciate you coming here. I'm sure Greg and Jeff appreciate you showing some love to mass adoption. One of your charts had a graph showing human energy production and energy consumption. And I think that anyone in the room that spent any time really learning about Bitcoin has realized that any time in the past humans have been able to harness a new form of energy, we flourished, right? When you look at local or global leadership, there's a lot of pushback against energy consumption and energy production. Do you feel like that is short-sightedness from global leaders and they don't see what, you just presented? Or do you think it's a fear of losing control of humans once we're able to harness energy more effectively and flourish, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, this gets the whole climate change, energy, that gets more political, but I mean, my view is that I think it's wrong to try to limit the number of humans or the amount of energy they can use. Yeah, I do think politicians are definitely short-sighted there. I think a lot of them have good intentions and are just doing it in a horrible way. That, in irony, is causing the exact problems they're trying to prevent. And I do think there's a lot of other politicians that have bad intentions. Not naming names, but I think that's up to everyone's own determination. But yeah, I think fundamentally when it comes down to it, having a perpetual climate overpopulation and pollution crisis down the line and using that as justification for allocating the newly created funds, I think that's an effective strategy for getting voters. And it's not just the more typically left-leaning folks. I think, the more military perspective, I think that's valid too. It's easy to scare people into voting for you when you can perpetually have this intangible enemy you need more government spending for. You have this intangible climate crisis. And so, I mean, anyway, like, these are real problems. Obviously, there are other militaries, and obviously we can't pollute the world, but yeah, I think it's short-sighted, and I think government should spend less time restricting things like nuclear energy or hydropower or whatever. And it's really it's baffling, I mean, we all saw with COVID and the lockdowns, it's like, we're trying to save energy, but ironically we diverted to more, to less efficient uses of energy to fix it. It's completely nonsensical. And for me, what really gets to my heart is limiting energy on the developing world, because it's like, I was in Guatemala back in February, it feels like forever ago. We were installing stoves, and it's like the same idea on a very localized basis. But they had these open wood fires in their homes. All their children were breathing this smoke, and it was horrible for cancer. It wastes so much time. They're chopping down so many trees. They're going to run out of forests. It's like all these problems, environmental, health, they're all related, and they all come back down to energy. And this organization is installing stoves to help them have less heat waste. So their food's go more efficiently, less trees cut down, less cancer, one cancer, And so it's like all these things, and I think it's evil to say that you have to use less energy, and I think the only right answer is to upgrade everyone to more efficiency, less health problems, less environmental problems. Like, it's not zero sum. I think we can have more humans and more energy and have lower pollution in the world than we do today. So anyway, there's a lot there, but yeah.
Any other questions?
You said humans need not apply should be on table. Is that a reference to Bitcoin or something else?
Oh no, it's just like video like 5 or 6 years old. I mean, it's aged pretty well, but I wish he would have new stuff. So, but yeah, I think that's a great video just because. Anyway, he's very sarcastic and it's I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's just very funny. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Although I wonder what his views are on Bitcoin. I actually don't know, but I've seen the little Bitcoin logo in these videos. So anyway, interesting.
Any other questions?
Great, one more.
I didn't even think of this, but what do you think about Bitcoin in space? Is that possible?
I think, to the other question, I don't know. I mean, yeah, Mars is, Mars is far away. It'd be a problem for, a block being every 10 minutes. I think it's one of those things where it's like, that's kind of the whole point of it being out our window. It's like, if I make any claim, it's going to age poorly, and it's probably going to be outdated in 5 years, and that'll be outdated. I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting to think about, but who knows? Yeah. Great question.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, give it up for Luke.